Today we are going to be wrapping up our discussion of Hesed in the book of Genesis by talking about Hesed in the life of Joseph.
Welcome to the Hesed series, part 4, and this is basically just some videos that we've been doing where we are just walking through every single occurrence of the word Hesed in the Bible. It's kind of a passion project, and we're going through it slowly but surely, just kind of some videos so that David has time to prepare for his Isaiah prophet videos, and just kind of going back and forth, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited for it, and we're just going to hop right in. But before we do that, I do just need to make my normal 2 announcements. If you want access to the slides that we are using right here, I have those for absolutely free for you. If you go to nowletsbehonest.com/resources, and if you want to support us on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/David Tate. And if you don't want to type that stuff out, I do have a link in the description down below for both of those 2 different things. Other than that, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because that is what lets YouTube know that this is stuff worth watching. And be sure to just kind of comment along with us or comment below what your thoughts are if we seem to be missing anything. But I'm going to open us up in a word of prayer, and we are going to wrap up our discussion of Hesed in Genesis.
Yes.
Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. I pray that you will direct our minds towards you, and you'll put our focus just in the right direction as we go into your word to kind of just figure out what this whole word Hesed means, what the concept is, what it has to tell us about who you are, how we relate to you, how you view us, and really just how we should conduct ourselves in our day-to-day living. I pray that we won't just go about this in a way that just puffs us up in knowledge, but that we'll actually grow in our knowledge about you and also our love for you, God. Please change us through our study of this word. Let it not just be a meaningless pursuit of information where we're just like figuring out what this word is and where it shows up in the Bible, but let it actually be something fruitful that really does change our understanding of who you are and helps us really understand what sets you apart from all the other gods that people worship. We love you, God. We thank you for who you are. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are going to get started by giving a little recap, like we probably will do pretty regularly. Going forward, I mean, we're not going to recap every single occurrence going forward, but we are going to just recap what showed up in Genesis, and we'll probably do the same thing in Exodus and everything like that.
Right.
But since this is the book of Genesis, which is a book about, tracing the family line of Abraham and stuff like that, it is a book about fathers, I guess you could say. It's probably worth mentioning that this video is debuting on Father's Day. And so I just want to wish a happy Father's Day to all of you fathers out there. I hope you had a great day, and thank you for doing all that you're doing. So I just thought I'd mention that, because this is was that a kind of lame segue?
No,
probably was a little bit.
That was actually a pretty good tie-in.
Yeah, because you got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the patriarchs, fathers, and
Father
I thought,
nations,
that wasn't too horrible.
No,
hopefully.
that was good. That was I liked it.
Okay, cool. Well, so we are in the book of Genesis, like I said, and the word Hesed appears 11 times in that book, and we have covered 8 of them so far. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of just very quickly recap the previous instances of Hesed, and we'll eventually get to our last 3 occurrences, which begin in Genesis 39, and then goes in chapter 40, and then 47. Okay, so just going through this. Our first occurrence of Hesed is in Genesis chapter 19 with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Funnily enough, I actually just got through this verse in my own personal study of Genesis a few days ago, because I'm in Genesis 19 right now, and I've been going slowly but surely through it, and I actually got to go even deeper into it in my own study than I did in this video, so it's kind of fun. And so that was at the Sodom and Gomorrah thing. Then you go to chapter 20, and this is back with Abraham, and he's discussing, basically you have this whole thing with him and his wife where he is asking her to lie about her relationship to him, and he's kind of abusing Hesed here, kind of like Lot did in chapter 19, and he's abusing this in such a way to kind of advance himself and to really protect himself at Sarah's detriment. And so the first 2 instances of Hesed we see are not necessarily the best. Yeah, we see it being abused. We also see that in chapter 21 as well, where Abraham is now interacting with Abimelech once again, but this is a little bit later on. And once again, people just keep abusing Hesed. And that's something that we spent a lot of time kind of talking about the first week we were doing this. It was in the second week of this whole series, but the first week going through Genesis. We just kind of talked about how Hesed is really closely connected to compassion and grace and stuff like that. And how, as Christians, a lot of times we're worried about if we are gracious to people, there's a good possibility they might abuse that, and we don't want to be doormats.
Yeah.
But biblically speaking, it seems like the Bible isn't necessarily as concerned with us being doormats as it is with us showing Hesed.
Yeah.
And so maybe there are times where people will abuse our graciousness and our compassion and our love. That's fine. The Bible doesn't really seem like, it doesn't seem like biblical love is too concerned with how people treat you. It's just concerned with how you treat people. And so if they treat you like a doormat, well, I guess we each have to figure that out in our own way.
Right.
But the Bible really doesn't seem to be that concerned about that. I mean, if you look at most of the faithful people in the Bible, they were treated like doormats. I mean, think about how Jesus allowed himself to be treated. And so that's kind of just interesting there. Then we got into chapter 24, and this is the story with, Abraham's servant going out and looking for a wife for Isaac. Would you like to kind of recap this story a little bit for us?
Yeah, so this is whenever he was trying to find a wife, and this occurrence was pretty interesting because every time it was talking about showing Hesed to Abraham and not to the servant himself, which is kind of cool. And that's kind of one of the first times that we've seen an occurrence like that. So it was always relating to his master and to Abraham instead of him.
Yeah, and then what we also saw just going throughout this is that the occurrences of Hesed weren't limited to just the actual words showing up, but we actually had the principles of Hesed showing up throughout the entire thing, both in how Rebecca was responding to the servant and how the servant was treating his master, Abraham, and stuff like that. And so we actually got to see these principles of Hesed showing up throughout the narrative, even beyond where the word itself literally showed up. And so we continued through there, and that actually showed up 4 times in this story. We have it twice on this slide, and then it shows up again there, and then again right there.
Oh, and it was the first time that it was with Emmett, too.
Yes, so we saw it a few times here, right? We saw it both in 24:27 and also in 24:49. We see Hesed showing up alongside Emmett, which is like Hesed and truth, which is going to be the most prominent connection that we're going to see throughout the entire Old Testament. It seems like those words are lumped together a whole lot. Michael Card calls this linguistic gravity. And it's just kind of unique. It's interesting to just kind of figure out why those two words are linked together there.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point I should even go do some research on what other people say about that.
Yeah.
And maybe we can do like a side video or something just talking about that. But yeah. And then we did one more thing at the very end of last video where we covered chapter 32, and this was talking about Jacob, right? And once again, we saw that Hesed plus Emet, a combination there. And this is where Jacob is praying to God shortly after he returns to the land of Israel, because Jacob is kind of just like this swindler dude. He rips off his brother, he leaves for a little bit, and then whenever he's coming back, he had made this promise to God saying, if you bring me back to this land, I will worship you. And so Jacob gets back to the land, and he says, God, I'm calling out to you, and I did not deserve the Hesed you showed to me, but you brought me back here. And so he kind of vows himself to him, and he's really, it seems like he's just kind of scared about meeting up with his brother again.
Yeah.
But it all ends up working out for Jacob, and it turns out very well. And what else you need to know about chapter 32 of Genesis, just because this will give us context going forward into the rest of our study today, is that Jacob's name later on in this chapter is changed to Israel. Because Jacob wrestles with God, and because he strove with God and prevailed, God changes his name to Israel, which literally means to strive with God. And this is going to be the name of Jacob and his descendants going forward, and they become the people of Israel. And that leads us to Genesis chapter 39. And like always, we're going to cover a little bit of context here. And so the main context you need to know going into this is that Jacob, during his time away from the promised land, I talked about how he ripped off his brother, he went away for a little bit and then came back. During that time, whenever he was away, he had 11 sons. Whenever he gets back, he has a 12th son. That kid's name is Benjamin, but he's not as important to this story right here. For right now, you need to know about those other 11 sons, because the youngest of those sons was named Joseph, and he was the child of Jacob's beloved wife. I was about to say daughter. Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel, right? Rachel and Jacob, they were like this kind of... I don't know, Jacob's kind of infatuated with her, and he seemed to really love her, but it also seemed like a very unhealthy thing. Really all of Jacob's relationships were very unhealthy.
Mm-hmm.
But Joseph becomes Jacob's favorite son,
Mm-hmm.
and whenever Jacob gets back into the promised land and he has all of his kids and stuff, and they're being raised up, Rachel eventually dies,
Mm-hmm.
and Jacob kind of begins to obsess over Joseph a little bit.
Like,
and
clings on to him.
Yeah, he clings to him kind of as like the final remembrances of his wife.
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph quickly rises through the ranks of the brothers
Yeah.
and becomes Jacob's favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And the brothers become very bitter about this. They turn against Joseph. You have the whole famous story where Joseph is gifted a coat of many colors by his father.
Mm-hmm.
And the brothers do not like this. And so they turn against Joseph and they plan to kill him. But they end up kind of just debating amongst themselves and decide not to kill him. And instead they sell him into slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph is sent off into Egypt as a slave. And that happens in, I believe, Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 38, we actually have this little side story with the fourth oldest brother named Judah, right? Because there's Reuben, Simeon, Levi, then you get Judah. And Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, they're all just all sorts of messed up in different ways. And so Judah's the fourth born, and we get the side story where we get to see that Judah's kind of messed up too, but by the end of the story, he learns his lesson, and there's a really cool redemptive arc going on with Judah throughout the book of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
But right here, we pick up in Genesis chapter 39, and where we encounter Joseph at is that he has been a slave for a few years in Egypt. But God has been with him, and God has remembered Joseph, and God has actually allowed him to rise through the ranks so that whenever we encounter him in Genesis 39, he is actually one of the leading slaves in this guy named Potiphar's household. And while he's there, we're going to see some different stuff kind of going on. But we basically have to know is that Joseph was a really good dude, a really faithful guy. And Potiphar trusted him so much that he basically gave him everything he had. With one exception, obviously, and that would be Potiphar's wife. And Joseph largely respected that. And that leads us to Genesis 39. We're going to pick up in verse 11. And could I have you read that for us?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One day he went into the house to do his work when none of the household servants were there in the house. She grabbed him by his outer garment, saying, "Come to bed with me." But he left his outer garment in her hand and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his outer garment in her hand and had run outside, she called for her household servants and said to them, "See, my husband brought in a Hebrew man to us to humiliate us. He tried to go to bed with me, but I screamed loudly. When he heard me raise my voice and scream, he left his outer garment beside me and ran outside." So she laid his outer garment beside her until his master came home. This is what she said to him. "That Hebrew slave you brought to us tried to humiliate me, but when I raised my voice and screamed, he left his outer garment and ran outside." When his master heard his wife say, "This is the way your slave treated me," he became furious. Joseph's master took him and threw him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, so he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness, or Hesed. He granted him favor in the sight of the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners under Joseph's care. He was in charge of whatever they were doing. The warden did not concern himself with anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he was doing, the Lord was making successful.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting story, and I'll probably even go into a little bit more backstory in just a second. But what I found so interesting about this occurrence of Hesed is that this does not sound like Hesed to us, because we've associated the word Hesed with graciousness and compassion and love and kindness, and the word kindness is used here. But the circumstances we find Joseph in, if they were occurring to us, we would probably not think that this was God being kind to us. Because here Joseph is, and he has found himself one of the highest ranking servants of a high ranking individual in Egypt.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he finds himself being falsely accused of doing something unspeakable, and he's thrown in prison. And then it says, and God showed kindness to him. And you're probably thinking, I mean, wouldn't the kindness of God involve him not being thrown in prison?
They're
and so it's
taking
like,
him out.
Yeah, and so what do you think about that?
It's kind of interesting. You wouldn't think that would be the situation. But then also, whenever we think of Hesed, it's something that it's given to you, but you don't deserve. But I guess the situation that he was in, he wasn't actually at fault. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like this twisted situation where you're like, you're getting a punishment that you didn't deserve. It's almost backwards. Like the punishment is what you're getting that you didn't deserve. And the Hesed is just kind of there. So it's kind of, it's interesting.
Well, it kind of makes me really appreciate Michael Card's wording of the definition that we've kind of been running with here, where it's like whenever you receive from somebody something you have no right to expect. Right,
yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because I can guarantee you that Joseph did not expect this to happen.
Right.
So, I mean, I still do think that this is God showing him kindness.
Oh, yes.
But it definitely, from a human perspective, if you were going through the same thing Joseph was going through here, you would probably expect something largely different from God. But I don't think that that's how Joseph felt, because we have to remember, who do you think eventually passed this story down? I would assume Joseph did. And whenever we encounter Joseph throughout Genesis, he seems to have a very good, positive mindset and outlook about all this. And so I think he probably knew what was going on here. But okay. So really, I think maybe we even have to, in order to best understand the story, we have to go a few verses ahead of this. And start really in the middle of verse 6, right? And I'm just going to read it. I got my little Hesed Bible right here. And when I say Hesed Bible, it's literally just a Bible where I've gone through and highlighted every occurrence of Hesed in the Bible. It took a while, but okay. So we see, it says, now Joseph was well built and good looking, right? So we're just knowing right off the bat, Joseph is a good looking individual. He is very attractive. We know that he went into slavery at about the age of 17, right? So a few years have passed. He's grown and he's been doing slave work, manual labor. And so, you know, he's at the height of good lookingness. The cards are in his favor. And soon after these things, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused, saying to his master's wife, look, my master does not give any thought to his household with me here, and everything that he owns he has put into my care. There is no one greater in this household than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do such a great evil and sin against God? Right? So we see that Joseph is a really, really good dude. And he's like, you know, a lot of times people find themselves in a position like this, and they would probably feel entitled, right? Potiphar has given them everything, and he'd probably think, you know what? I've had a tough lot in life. You know what? His wife's pursuing me. Let's do it. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he humbly says, hey, how could I sin against God there? And he doesn't just say sin against Potiphar. He says, how could I sin against God by being with you? It's a matter of moral principle. He's like, I cannot allow myself to do that. And then verse 10, it says, even though she continued to speak to Joseph day after day, he did not respond to her invitation to go to bed with her. Right? And so the reason I wanted to include that stuff is that we see that this was not a one-time occurrence. Right? This was something that had dragged out day after day after day. She keeps making these advances upon him. You can kind of imagine it. Well, yeah, he's consistently turning it down, and you can kind of imagine how this would increasingly frustrate her, but you can almost imagine it in like a TV show or a movie where it's like, you know, you have this woman constantly hitting on him, and they're probably closer to the same age, I'd imagine, because, you know, men would usually marry younger women, and so I don't know how old Potiphar was, but he probably married a younger woman, and then Joseph's, you know, in his probably early 20s at this point, if not still a teenager. And so she sees him, she's like, hey, what's up, good looking? And you can just imagine her constantly kind of doing this, and because she has the power, he really can't do anything about it, but he is very humble and responsive here, and he says, I cannot sin against God, and Joseph's just a really good guy of noble character. That leads us to verse 11. One day, he went into the house to do his work when none of the household servants were there in the house. We see how this is going to be abused very quickly, right? There's nobody around. There's nobody accountable. She grabbed him by his outer garment saying, come to bed with me. She's kind of trying to force him a little bit. But he left his outer garment in her hand and ran outside. He's like, I am not doing this, which is really admirable of this guy, right? I mean, you literally have a person of higher rank doing this, and whenever he's running outside, he's probably fully aware of the fact that she could twist this for her own personal gain. Right? I mean, he is a servant. She is in the higher position here. I mean,
he's having to pick like the best situation out of the two worst, I guess.
Because if he went along with it, he probably would be able to maintain his position and make her happy, and as a guy, he probably would not be, you know, he'd probably enjoy it a little bit. But instead, he chooses to do the right thing here. And he flees away. When she saw that he had left his outer garment in her hand and run outside, we see how quick he'd run, right? I mean, he just tore out of it. And we see that she was probably being pretty forceful if she's still holding on to the garment. She called for her household servants and said to them, see, my husband brought in a Hebrew man to us to humiliate us. He tried to go to bed with me, but I screamed loudly. When he heard me raise my voice and scream, he left his outer garment beside me and ran outside.
A little twisted.
Very, very twisted, right?
Not exactly how
Basically, she's flip-flopping it.
Yeah.
Right? This is the hashtag Me Too movement, but Joseph is the one who is in the Me Too situation, but it's flip-flopped, where the woman's saying, no, he did it to me.
Yeah.
And most likely, I would imagine that the servants probably knew Joseph's character better because he was the lead servant. But you can't speak back against Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar is definitely going to, the evidence probably doesn't look too good against Joseph here. Because here he is. There's nobody there. They were all alone. He's a good-looking dude. He's received everything from Potiphar.
Possibly around her age, too.
And what do you think he's going to go for next? Potiphar's wife. He's trying to take over.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, verse 16, she laid out his outer garment beside her until the master came home. This is what she said to him. That Hebrew slave you brought to us tried to humiliate me. But when I raised my voice and screamed, he left his outer garment and ran outside. So she repeats the story once again. And we see, once again, poor Joseph, who's been nothing but a good guy so far. He just keeps getting put in horrible, horrible situations. When his master heard his wife say, this is the way your slave treated me, he became furious. Joseph's master took him and threw him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. The king here would be like the Pharaoh, right? So he was there in the prison. And so, once again, we see Joseph's entire story flip-flopped.
Yeah.
Joseph's story, whenever you look at it, it's just like an undulating pattern of good and bad, good and bad, good and bad. He will be dealt a horrible hand of cards, but God will be with him, and he'll rise through the ranks. Then something bad will happen, he'll be lowered back down, then he'll rise through the ranks. And it's really just kind of this awesome story about excellence and faith and just, just not complaining and really just dealing with the lot that you've been given in life and just being faithful to God regardless of the outcome.
And his character stays pretty consistent throughout his whole story, too.
Yeah.
There's not really, like, a huge moment where he, like, falls into this, like, deep pit or anything like that. It's, like, it stays pretty good. Yeah,
well, it's one of those things where I think it's kind of almost like a big plot twist in the book of Genesis because you're reading the story and there's so much focus on Joseph and you've been waiting for this promised seed to show up.
Yeah.
And part of you is kind of like, oh, man, is Joseph the promised seed?
Yeah.
And then it turns out to be Judah. Of all people, who is demonstrated to be a pretty horrible person, but who has like this amazing redemptive arc. But yeah, Joseph, he really is an amazing person, and even going throughout history, there are some Jews nowadays who hold to this double messianic perspective, where they say that there's the Messiah son of David and Messiah son of Joseph, because whenever you actually look at Old Testament messianic prophecies, you have both sides. You have this kingly, righteous figure who reigns over all people, and that's definitely the Messiah. But then you also have this suffering servant figure who is a lot like Joseph. And so some Jews actually hold this like double messianic thing. Like maybe there's two Messiahs. There's the king and there's the suffering servant. Whereas we believe Jesus did both, right? Really, during his first incarnation, he was more like Joseph.
Yeah.
But okay, so here Joseph is. His entire life has been flip-flopped once again. Despite rising through the ranks, he finds himself thrown into prison by the one person he has served faithfully for all this time because he has been falsely accused. And then we read, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him Hesed.
It's like, nice little breath of fresh air.
Yeah. But at the same time, in Hebrew, I just want to kind of clarify that, like, the way that we translate things is that the word, like the conjunctions and but mean radically different things for us, right? If it said, and the Lord was with Joseph, that would be like continuing that thought.
Yeah.
The word but is like, oh, plot twist, right?
Yes.
In Hebrew, it's the same word, right? It's literally just a single letter that comes before the rest of the word, and it's wa, right? So it would say, and God was with Joseph. And so we kind of have to make this interpretive thing to where we say, but the Lord was with Joseph. In Hebrew, though, it literally just says, and the Lord was with Joseph.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of sitting there and you're saying, I mean, is God presently showing him Hesed? Like, was the Hesed throwing him into prison? Or is the Hesed the thing that God shows him while he's in prison?
Right.
And I would say it's probably a mixture of both. I think that it was Hesed that put Joseph in prison, but it's also Hesed that's going to elevate him even while he's in prison into the highest rank.
Right.
And so the Lord was with Joseph and showed him Hesed. He granted him favor in the sight of the prison warden. You see the word favor there? Once again, we see that there's certain terms that kind of are pulled towards Hesed.
Right.
Whenever we were talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, we saw the words compassion, favor, all of that near Hesed. We see Hesed and truth. Here we see the word favor, right? God showed him kindness, showed him Hesed, and Yahweh granted him favor in the sight of the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners under Joseph's care. He was in charge of whatever they were doing. The warden did not concern himself with anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with him, and whatever he was doing, the Lord was making successful. So, we see that somehow this is Hesed. What do you think about that?
It's interesting because it doesn't really show time passing. Like, it seems like it happened almost pretty immediately. Which is interesting, which I guess would come from the unexpected part. So that would make sense because it doesn't seem like he has to in any way prove himself to the prison warden. It's just like he comes in and he's aware that the Lord is with him and that he shows him favor, and so he rises in the ranks, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there probably was some time that passed where Joseph demonstrated his character and stuff. But, yeah, I think that really is part of it because just think about how Joseph's situation flips here. Here he's been falsely accused. He's probably at the lowest he's ever been because, I mean, it was one thing. He was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery. But then he got this glimmer of hope whenever he was rising through the ranks. And he was thinking, you know what? Maybe I can make a new life for myself here in Egypt. And then that gets ripped apart from him. He's thrown in prison once again. And now it's like twice as bad, right? Because you're like, man, there go my options there. What are the chances of getting out of this? But then even in prison, the warden of the whole place sees that he's such an admirable person that he puts him in charge of the prison. Now think about how weird that is. Like, talk about Hesed being unexpected. This is a prisoner being put in charge of other prisoners. And basically the warden is allowing Joseph to do his job.
And it's also very parallel to the same situation whenever he originally got all of the power. Whenever Potiphar's whenever he gave him all the stuff, it was almost kind of the same wording. He's like, I'm going to give everything into your care. Like, you were able to rule over all of it.
And we're going to see it again whenever we get to Joseph with Pharaoh, right? So we have this constant repetition where Joseph just proves himself as such a character that people naturally give their authority to him, right? Potiphar gives the authority to Joseph. The warden gives his authority to Joseph. Pharaoh will give his authority to Joseph. And so it's constantly being given to him. But once again, it's highly unexpected, right? He has no right to expect this. If anything, he's probably expecting worse to happen to him at this point because it seems like he keeps getting dealt bad hands in life, no matter what he does. But here he is in prison, and it says God showed him Hesed. And I think if you're really wanting to know how God showed him Hesed, you got to go to that last verse there. The warden did not concern himself with anything that was in Joseph's care because the Lord was with him, and whatever he was doing, the Lord was making successful, right? So whatever Joseph did, Yahweh made it happen. So if Joseph was taking out the trash, he would be the best at doing it. If he was back in Potiphar's household, if he was doing anything there, God would make it happen so that he was the best at doing it and he was successful in all the things he strove for. And I think that's really how it's saying that God showed him Hesed, because God's almost supernaturally equipping him to just be an amazing, amazing figure, to where everybody who sees him is impressed by him. Even the warden of a prison. I mean, think about that. If you're the warden of a prison, you're probably not looking at these people like
with
they're
high regards.
You're probably looking at these people as like the scum of the earth who don't really deserve anything. But here this guy gets thrown in, being accused of violating his master's wife. I mean, think about that. You're probably not wanting to give this guy any power because the last guy who gave him power, apparently he tried to do something to his wife.
Like, what is he going to do to me?
What are you going to do to me if I give you power? But then he still is so impressed by Joseph that he elevates him. And so I think that really the emphasis of this time that Hesed shows up is the unexpectedness of it all. Whereas each time it occurs, we see kind of a different aspect, right? Compassion, kindness, graciousness. This one seems to be the unexpectedness of it, which probably kind of goes into the word kindness. You can see why they translated it like that, because kindness, I think, kind of is supposed to be unexpected. Because if you're not... if it's expected kindness, it's just rational response. So there's that occurrence. And then we go into the next chapter, and Joseph is still in prison, right? We go on, and this literally is just picking up in the next verse, right? So that thing we just read was chapter 39. Now we get to, that was the end of chapter 39. Now we're at the beginning of chapter 40. I'm going to read this, and then we will talk about it. Cool. After these things happened, the cupbearer to the king of Egypt and the royal baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was enraged with his 2 officials, the cupbearer and the baker, so he imprisoned them in the house of the captain of the guard in the same facility where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be their attendant, and he served them. They spent some time in custody. Both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream the same night. Each man's dream had its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were looking depressed. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" They told him, "We both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them." Joseph responded, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. "In my dream there was a vine in front of me. On the vine there were 3 branches. As it budded, its blossoms opened and its clusters ripened into grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes, squeezed them into his cup, and put the cup in Pharaoh's hand." "This is its meaning," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 more days, Pharaoh will reinstate you and restore you to your office. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you did before when you were cupbearer. But remember me when it goes well for you, and show me Hesed. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and bring me out of this prison. For I really was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and I have done nothing wrong here, for which they should put me in a dungeon." All right, what do you think about that?
This is interesting because thinking about what the definition of Hesed is, it's kind of interesting how Joseph asked for it. Like he says, remember me and show me Hesed, which usually is something that it would be unexpected or something that you don't deserve, and so naturally it's probably going to come without you having to ask for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting. It reminds me of whenever Abraham and Sarah, however he asked Sarah to show him Hesed, which is a little bit of a different situation, but asking for it is kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Which is
No, I think that they're very 2 similar situations, but I think how Joseph does it is a much more positive example.
right. Yeah.
Whenever Abraham was telling Sarah, asking her to show him Hesed, it was at her own cost and at her own detriment and for his own benefit. Right here, Joseph is asking something for his own benefit, but it doesn't cost the cupbearer anything. In fact, it's actually for his own elevation, right? This guy's going to be put back in his office, and Joseph's asking, "Just remember me."
Yeah.
I think the key here, if we're going back to Michael Card's definition, is that you have the right to expect nothing, right? So it isn't merely unexpected, it's that you don't have the right to expect it, right? So Joseph does want this guy to do this thing for him, but at the same time, he knows that he doesn't have the right to expect it. This is probably something, when it comes to applying it, I think that this really sticks out in our modern culture, because a lot of the times, whenever we do something kind for somebody else, we expect them to do something in return. And that's not how we should do things, because then you're not being kind to them, you're purely doing it because you want something back.
To get personal gain.
And I think that's why it's key that Joseph uses this word here, because he's pointing out, hey, I'm helping you out no matter what you do in return. I just ask that you would return a favor to me. You don't have to, but I'd really appreciate it if you did.
Yeah.
And so I think that's pretty key, because as Christians, of course, that's what we should want, right? Obviously, we want everybody to be loving and kind and gracious to everybody else, but that's not, unfortunately, how it is. And so Joseph is showing Hesed to the man, and he's asking him to reciprocate it. Because as we're going to see as we go through this, Hesed is supposed to be reciprocal, right? I show you Hesed, you show me Hesed, and eventually the whole world is abounding in Hesed, because that's the character of God. But most often that's not how it is, but as Christians, we do ourselves a disservice whenever we expect it. And I just see that a lot of times. I see Christians guilty of this as much as non-Christians, where we do something kind for somebody else, and then they do something not as kind for us, and we're just like, but I did this for you, and we start listing out all the things we did right, and we use it against them. And it's like, okay, well, if you're going to use those things against that person, then you weren't actually doing that for the right reasons, right? You were doing that because you wanted to purchase a kindness from them as well. And that's not right. We should do kindness, and we should be gracious, and we should show Hesed to others because it's the right thing to do, regardless of how they respond. Once again, that allows you to possibly be a doormat.
I was about to say that.
Right? Because as we're going to see in this story, the guy's going to forget Joseph for a while. And Joseph is going to be that doormat, right? He showed this guy Hesed. He asked the guy to return the Hesed, and the guy's going to forget. But eventually the guy does remember. But let's say the guy hadn't remembered. Would that mean that Joseph shouldn't have done it? No. Joseph was doing the right thing. I think as Christians, same thing. We should be gracious to people, even if they abuse it. Yikes.
Yeah.
I know if you live in America or in the Western world, you might not like hearing that, but I think that might be what the Bible's telling us here. And maybe we'll find an example where that's not the case, but I haven't seen one yet. Mm-hmm. So let's walk through this. After these things happened, the cupbearer to the king of Egypt and the royal baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. Uh-oh.
Not good.
That's not good. So Pharaoh was enraged with his two officials, the cupbearer and the baker, so he imprisoned them in the house of the captain of the guard in the same facility where Joseph was confined. Wow. Very convenient. Yeah, it's like, wow, they happen to be in the same prison. There's probably many prisons in Egypt. Mm-hmm. They happen to be put in the same exact one. Mm-hmm. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be their attendant, and he served them. Wow. Whoa. This seems to just all be sliding into place, right? It's like, wow, Joseph happens to be a prisoner in charge of them. Isn't this interesting, though? I just find it so interesting. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be their attendant. Like, Joseph is a fellow prisoner.
Yeah.
But he is being appointed as, like, an attendant to other prisoners. And it does say that he served them, right? So he is still functioning in the role of a servant and probably as a prisoner. But there's still, like, this extra level of responsibility. Like, he is a prisoner attendant, which means that he's kind of, like, higher up. Like, yes, he's still serving, but he's probably getting it a little bit better off. It's just kind of funny.
Yeah.
They spent some time in custody. Both of them, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream the same night. Each man's dream had its own meaning. We see dreams popping up a lot during the story of Joseph, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, what you do with it, you're like, okay, interesting. Yeah. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were looking depressed, which is interesting because, I mean, they must have known that the dreams had some sort of special meaning to them.
Right.
Because, I mean, I have dreams all the time, and I don't just wake up depressed, right? Yeah. So each of these guys, they woke up, they had a very specific dream, and we're only going to cover one of the dreams in this story just because, just for time's sake. Yeah. When it comes to our discussion of Hesed, we're only just discussing one of them, but the dreams are very similar.
Right.
And so maybe they talk to them, and they're like, these did not seem like good dreams. Mm-hmm. And so they both seem very depressed, and Joseph, being their attendant, comes to check in on them, and he's like, hey guys, what's up? Mm-hmm. You need to talk? Yeah. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in custody in the master's house. I love the repetition here. It's just trying to like almost emphasize God's Hesed, right? Mm-hmm. Like, look at how God is lining all of this up, right? You have these officials, like the people who know Pharaoh. Mm-hmm. They are in prison. Joseph's in prison, right? They are in the same house that Joseph's in. Whoa. And like, it's like just repeating it again and again and again just to like drill into your head that God is providing for Joseph. Mm-hmm. So he asked the Pharaoh's officials who were with him in custody in the master's house, why do you look so sad today? Why the glum face? They told him, we both had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them. Once again, just very interesting. Different culture than we live in nowadays. I mean, nowadays I have a lot of family members who come up to me and they're like, hey, tell me about this dream. And I'm like, I have no idea. I think you're just afraid of cockroaches. But they definitely looked into these dreams, and there was something special about them where they're like, these need interpretation. Mm-hmm. And Joseph responds quite humbly, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me. Mm-hmm. And so some people might look at this and say that it's a very proud statement, because he's like, don't they belong to God? Tell them to me. So it's like he's comparing himself to God, but I don't think that's what he's doing. No. I just think that Joseph has demonstrated his ability to interpret dreams in the past, and he's also living in a pagan culture and realizes that he worships the God of Israel, the one who created everything. And so he's like, hey, tell them to me and we'll see if God gives us an answer. Yeah. I think it's actually a humble response.
And we can tell from like other times we have seen him speak and other interactions he's had with other people that wouldn't be consistent with his character if it was coming off as like a proud statement. That would definitely stick out a lot more than what it does, I think.
Yeah, and some people think that he was a bit proud in chapter 37 with his brothers. I think he was just young. Some people look at, they're like, oh, he's just cocky, but I think that he was just a young kid who was just like, guys, I had this crazy dream. Y'all were bowing down to me. Yeah. And people are like, see how cocky he is? I'm like, I think he's just being honest. He's like, I'm confused as this by y'all are. Mm-hmm. I'm as confused about this as y'all are. Yeah. Can't talk. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. In my dream, there was a vine in front of me. On the vine there were 3 branches. As it budded, its blossoms opened, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes, squeezed them into his cup, and put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And he's like, I don't get what this means. Mm-hmm. This is its meaning, Joseph said to him. No hesitation, right? Boom. Mm-hmm. The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 more days, Pharaoh will reinstate you and restore you to your office. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you did before when you were cupbearer. Very exciting news, right? This is
what
really
you
good.
Hear whenever you're like in prison.
Yeah, and it's really gonna lift you up from your depression, right?
Yeah.
He's probably thinking like, oh man, this is like a bad omen or something. And he's like, wow, this is exciting news. I'm gonna be reinstated into my high and lofty position as like cupbearer to the king, which is a very prominent place.
The poor baker.
But yeah, I know. And then Joseph continues, but remember me when it goes well for you, right? Remember me. I think that might be a key aspect to Hesed as well. maybe I need to look that up. How many times the word remember occurs next to Hesed? Because there's the whole reciprocal nature of it. I bet it shows up quite a bit. I don't even know how I really looked that up other than just looking up every time the word remember shows up and cross-referencing it to how many times, where Hesed shows up. But
and it'll probably occur between other characters, but also God, because there's a lot of times when it shows God remembered so-and-so, God remembered so-and-so, and showed them kindness.
Yeah, because I think a big aspect of remembering from a biblical perspective or a theological perspective is that, once again, it's not, you don't have the right to expect it, right? A person is being gracious by remembering.
Right.
Because we shouldn't just naturally feel entitled like we so often do to people's attention, right? So whenever God remembers his people, suffering in Egypt in the book of Exodus, I think that is an act of Hesed, because he's remembering wow, they're suffering, and God could have just forgotten about them, but he chose not to. He chose to bring them back to mind, and I think that is a big aspect of it. So he says, but remember me when it goes well for you, and show me Hesed. Show me kindness. Show me this thing I have no right to expect from you. I'm just asking that you do it. I think there's also this element, we've seen it both in the last one and in this. Hesed has to do with elevating the other person. Hesed is it's not something that pushes somebody down, and if it is, it's a bad example of Hesed. Right. Hesed is something that is all about elevating the other person. That was the other problem whenever Abraham asked Sarah to, because he was saying, hey, throw yourself under the bus so that I can be lifted up. Better. Right. And so he was asking her to show Hesed, but at the same time, he was not showing it to her. Right? It was a one-way Hesed that was only for his own benefit. Whereas here, Joseph, it's like a mutual Hesed, right? Hey, I'm lifting you up. You lift me up as well, please. But at the same time, it's humble enough to where he's saying, I don't expect you to do this. I'm just asking a favor from you because you're going to be in this position where you can help me out, and I really don't have any other options here. And so he's really just trying to get out of prison.
Yeah.
Make mention of me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this prison, for I really was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and I've done nothing wrong here for which they should have put me in a dungeon. He's like, guys, I've just been dealt the bad hand after bad hand. I was sold into Egypt. I was kidnapped by my own brothers, sold into Egypt. Here I am. I was a slave. I rose through the ranks and things were going well. I thought I had a new life in front of me, and then I got falsely accused, and here I am. And I've risen through the ranks in this prison, but I'm still in prison. Yeah. And I have really no expectation of getting out because when's the expiration date on being accused of doing something to your, master's wife?
And you're also a foreigner too. It's not like you were someone that was native of the land that was super high up to where you could have people kind of advocating for you. You're just a foreigner that came in as a slave, so you don't have a reputation following you and stuff.
Yeah. And any friends he had would probably be fellow slaves who definitely are not going to speak against the master's wife unless they want to be thrown in prison as well. But here he actually has access to somebody who can help him out because they're going to be serving somebody who is even higher above Potiphar, right? They're going to be serving the Pharaoh. And he's like, hey guys, I know I have no right to expect anything from you, but I know that you're going to be delivered out of here, right? You are going to be out of this prison. You're going to be the cupbearer to the king again. That means you're going to be in close proximity to the king and close proximity to somebody who could get me out of here. I know that I have no right to expect anything from you, but could you please do something unbelievable for me and get me out of this prison? And the guy's going to be like, yeah, I'll do it. And then he doesn't. Yeah. And he forgets for a while. Yeah. But another fun fact about this story, before we move on to our last occurrence of Hesed in Genesis, is that this conversation really motivates the baker. Right? And the baker is like...
the poor baker.
Yeah, the baker's like, man,
if
that dude...
If good, mine's good.
Yeah, he's like, if that dude just got good news, I had a similar dream, let me tell you about it. And Joseph's like,
about that.
Yeah, about that. In 3 days, you're going to die.
Yeah.
And you're going to have your head chopped off. And
he's like, you'll come out of the prison, but
Not in
Not
one
alive.
piece.
Not
Not in one
alive.
piece. Yeah. And so that's kind of a funny little thing there. And so there is our second to last occurrence of Hesed in Genesis. And now we jump forward to chapter 47. And in between these chapters, so much happens. So I said that the cupbearer forgot about Joseph, but eventually he remembered. And the thing that sparks his memory is that Pharaoh also has a dream that nobody can interpret.
Yep.
And it's a crazy dream. And the cupbearer's like, whoa, a few years back, like this is years later. He's like, a few years back, there was this guy who interpreted my dream, and it turned out he was right. Maybe he could help you out.
Yeah.
And so Pharaoh calls him forward, and Joseph is like, hey, so here's the situation. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And you probably should really appoint somebody to be in charge of this thing who really knows what they're doing. Maybe somebody who knows how to interpret things that nobody else knows how to interpret. He's kind of heavily emphasized, like,
Played his cards well.
yeah, he's playing his cards really well, and he's before Pharaoh, and he's kind of being like, get me out of this prison, don't forget me here. And Pharaoh kind of picks up on that, and he's like, how about you be second in command of all Egypt? And Joseph's like, sure, why not?
How sweet of you.
Yeah. And so what eventually happens throughout the story is that that kind of made Joseph seem a little bit prouder than he really is. Like, he's still a really humble dude, but whenever you're reading the story, you can tell he's like, I want to get out of here, and he's heavily hinting that he should be the one in charge. But eventually Joseph's put second in command of all Egypt. So once again, that undulating pattern lands him up at the top. And you see how all the affliction that he went through ultimately paved the way to get him here.
Yeah.
Right? So it's actually really neat how God showed him Hesed through this, right? Who would have thought whenever he was being falsely accused of doing something evil that it would have eventually gone on the path to get him to second in command of all Egypt?
Yeah.
Right?
That's a huge
Crazy.
jump. Yeah.
Right? No right to expect that. But here he is, second in command of all Egypt, and he is kind of taking care of the place. 7 more years pass of plenty where he's gathering all the crops. And then the 7 years of famine hit. Joseph is in command of all Egypt. I think he's about 30 years old at this time. And the more time is passing, and lo and behold, the famine isn't just in Egypt. It's all throughout the land.
Right.
And there's this family living over in Canaan, the sons of Jacob. Maybe you've heard of him. And they realize we need bread. We need food. And they heard that apparently there is grain in Egypt. And so Jacob sends his sons over to Egypt to get some grain. And they don't recognize it, but the very person who they approach to get grain from is their brother Joseph. Crazy.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, and a few chapters pass here, and there's like this kind of long thing where Joseph's kind of testing his brother's characters, but eventually he reveals himself to them. That sounded kind of inappropriate. He reveals his identity to them. He reveals his identity to them. And they're like, oh, whoa, Joseph, you're alive. And they're really scared for their lives. But he is very gracious to them. And he's like, guys, it's fine. I forgive you. And he actually invites them to live in Egypt with him. He's like, hey, guys, I know that there's a famine going over in Canaan. But come over to Egypt and hang out here with us. And what's interesting is that this actually aligns with what God had said would happen to Abraham, right? Back in the day, he said, your family is going to sojourn in a land that is not theirs for 400 years, and then I'll deliver them. And so this is all laying the groundwork for the big climax of Genesis, where we realize that the promises of God are coming to fulfillment, but they aren't in the right land. And so that leads us to Genesis chapter 47, where we are going to see Joseph bring his family to dwell in Egypt. Could you read that for us?
Absolutely. Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how long have you lived? Jacob said to Pharaoh, all the years of my travels are 130. All the years of my life have been few and painful. The years of my travels are not as long as those of my ancestors. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers. He gave them territory in the land of Egypt, in the best region of the land, in the land of Ramses, just as Pharaoh had commanded. Joseph also provided food for his father, his brothers, and his father's household, according to the numbers of their little children.
And then right there in verses 13 through 26, we just have some further details of Joseph's administration. It just basically lists out all his accomplishments. So I just throw that in there.
Now we're at 27.
Yep.
Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they owned land there. They were fruitful and increased rapidly in number. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. The years of Jacob's life were 147 in all. The time for Israel to die approached, so he called for his son Joseph and said to him, "If now I found favor in your sight," there's the word favor again, "put your hand under my thigh and show me kindness," or hesed, "and faithfulness," or emet. "Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." Joseph said, "I will do as you say." Jacob said, "Swear to me that you will do so." So Joseph gave him his word. Then Israel bowed down at the head of his bed.
Yeah, and then going forward from there, we go into chapter 48, and that is where you have the whole Manasseh and Ephraim, Joseph's two sons, being brought forward, and they're going to actually turn into two tribes of Israel, and it's going to be a kind of cool thing. But yeah, so here is our final occurrence of Hesed in the book of Genesis, and look at that. We see that it shows up right next to Emet again, right? We see Hesed and truth. But we also see favor showing up in there as well. So that's kind of cool as well. So let's walk through this.
Yeah, let's do it.
Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How long have you lived?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "All the years of my travels are 130. I feel like with Jacob, you have to kind of sound really more dramatic. He's like, "All the years of my travels are 130. All the years of my life have been few and painful. The years of my travels are not as long as those of my ancestors." I feel like that's just how Jacob would talk.
Jacob's very dramatic.
Yeah, yes. Jacob is a very dramatic dude. But also at the same time, he's honest.
That's true.
Because his life has not been as nice as his ancestors has been. Abraham, yes, he did abandon everything, but he lived a mostly like... if you just look at the Abraham story, there's a lot of really cool stories, but he's prospering during most of it, right? Sure, he was nomadic and stuff like that, but he had a lot of money. He was rich. He was thriving. He was mainly just chilling out at his tent most of the times we find him. And then, there are some stories where he has to, go to war and everything.
Yeah.
But Abraham, most of the stuff that goes wrong with him is, just kind of very small stuff that's very quickly brushed over.
Yeah.
Isaac... there's a little bit of conflict in his life, but honestly, we don't spend that much time seeing what Isaac did.
We don't know a lot about
which is probably a good sign, right? Usually, a lot of details in your life suggest that a lot of bad stuff happened, like with Joseph. But then you get to Jacob, and Jacob really did have a tough life. He brought most of it upon himself.
Yes.
For sure.
Very stubborn, so it kind of...
Yeah, he's stubborn, he's deceitful. He brought it upon himself, but he is being honest whenever he says that, I've had a rough life. And think about it. A majority of his final years, he thought that his favorite son had been brutally murdered by a pig or something. And then he has to learn that apparently his other sons had kind of just lied about it, I guess. Because eventually he's I don't know. I wonder how that conversation went.
I know.
It's hey, our brother's alive. Did they tell him that we sold him into slavery, or were they I guess he didn't get mauled by a pig. I guess that was weird. I don't know. So Jacob really did have a tough life. And so he's being pretty honest here, but at the same time, it is still very dramatic.
Yeah.
It's how Jacob is. All the years of my life have been few and painful. And it's dude, you're 130 years old. That's not that young.
It's not few.
But still, the years of my travels are not as long as my ancestors, and that's true because Abraham, he lived to be 180 or something like that, and then Isaac lived to be not too much younger than that, huh?
Yeah.
It might have been the same age. I don't remember. I don't remember how old Isaac was. I remember that Isaac lived 20 years longer than he thought he would.
Yes.
Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence, right? So we just have this encounter where literally you got Jacob in the presence of Pharaoh, right? Think about how far these people have come.
Right.
Even though, Abraham also was in the presence of a Pharaoh once, but that didn't really go too well. Okay. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers. He gave them territory in the land of Egypt, in the best region of the land of Ramesses, just as Pharaoh had commanded. And once again, Ramses was probably not the name of the land at that time period, because this would have been before Ramses was around. This would be a few hundred years before that. But this is probably, for the people who are reading this text, Ramses would have been the name they were familiar with, right?
Also, I think that it doesn't explicitly say that this is Hesed, but the fact that they're getting this, best land in the area that's, super fruitful and everything, it's kind of interesting, because that God is with Joseph, and it's, in his favor. And these are just... the only connection that they have to Egypt at all is Joseph. So, like, these are complete foreigners. They don't know the rest of the people that are in Egypt. It's only because of Joseph and that he's in power. So it's kind of interesting to see kind of how that works, because that itself, I think, is an act of Hesed.
Yeah. The fact that Joseph was elevated to such a power as this, to where he can give away the best land, it's like, whoa, nice.
Yeah.
This is where I imagine, Potiphar's wife is like listening to the radio, and Toby Keith's "How Do You Like Me Now" starts playing. How do you like me now that I'm on my way?
Yeah.
Basically, this is where Joseph's just like, yeah, how'd that work out for you, buddy? Now I'm the second powerful in all the land. Joseph also provided food for his father, his brothers, and all his father's household according to the number of all their little children. This is crazy. Especially when you imagine, I mean, this is definitely Hesed on the part of Joseph, considering the fact that all the hardship in his life has stemmed, honestly, his father's kind of to blame for this, because the brothers' animosity against him started with his father's favoritism, right? And so really, he kind of has to blame his father a little bit, his brothers even more so. But he is just showing kindness to all of them. And he is just blessing every single one of them by providing for them. And whenever they actually ask him about this towards the end of the book, he explains it to them, and he's like really gracious. Like after Jacob finally dies, the brothers are afraid, and they say, "Ooh, maybe Joseph will pay us back. Maybe he was just being nice to us while Dad was alive. And now that Dad's dead, he's really gonna come for us." And Joseph's like, "No." He's like, "What you intended for evil, God intended for good."
Yeah.
And that is just such a mature mindset.
Yeah.
To where nowadays, I mean, we just look at the worst, like, we just look at the smallest things that happen in our lives, and we look for a reason to blame everybody else. Joseph looks at these very extreme situations, and he finds a reason to search for God in them.
Yeah.
And he sees how he can use those to bless even those who persecuted him.
Yeah. Very admirable.
So you see how Joseph is parallel to Jesus in a lot of ways, because, I mean, he's literally blessing his enemies, right? And he's helping out the very people who brought about all his hardship.
And it's his own people that betrayed him.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Nice. So Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they owned land there. They were fruitful and increased rapidly in number. You can see how this is kind of building towards the conclusion of Genesis, because one of the earliest commands was be fruitful and multiply. And then whenever you get to Abraham, God's command is like, hey, or his covenant is, I'm going to give you land, I'm going to give you a big family, and I'm going to bless people through you, and I'm going to bless you. Well, we see the last of those two things happening here, right? The family's expanding, and they're being blessed, and are being a blessing to others. Like, Joseph is the one blessing his own people, but he's also being a blessing to everyone around him. You see this being fulfilled. The only thing is that they don't live in the land, and so you know the covenant isn't fulfilled yet. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. The years of Jacob's life were 147 in all. Once again, we see that the children of Abraham and the grandchildren, like, they just seem to live longer than they expect.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He's like, oh, I've been 130 years. I'm probably about to die. And it's like, nah, dude, you're still around for 17 more years. The time for Israel to die approached, so he called for his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and show me Hesed and Emet. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in the burial place. Joseph said, I will do as you say. So what do you think about those occurrences of Hesed?
This one I think is a lot like the last occurrence, because he's asking of it, but the word if at the very beginning, he's like, if I found favor. He's not expecting to find favor. Yeah. He's like, if I did, it's, he's asking for something, but he's also putting it into Joseph's hands. Here's my request, but he gives it to Joseph, and he says, you discern and do with it as you will. If I found favor, I'm asking for this, but I'm not expecting you to do that before I die. Yeah.
There might even be a layer of personal responsibility that he feels for Joseph's circumstances, right? Yeah. He might recognize, hey, I kind of put you in all this stuff. Like, maybe he was like, I understand my responsibility in you being there. So if I find favor in your sight, if you will humble yourself to such a position to worry about an old man's bones, please do this for me.
And this is like one of Jacob's height, like in his like history. This is definitely one of like his high points, I think.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of times when he does not request of something, he demands of things. Yeah. And so this is because he's a very stubborn person, and it wasn't until really after he like kind of wrestled with God and the whole like Esau and him around that time, the situation, that he kind of humbled himself a little bit more. And so this is kind of one of the height high moments
Yeah.
of his
No, that's true.
encounters.
I hadn't even thought of that because
Yeah.
Jacob, I was going to say Joseph. Jacob really is a guy who, we've talked about this a lot, at least. I don't know if we've mentioned it in these videos. It would have been the last video if so.
Yeah.
But he's a guy who really doesn't know how to accept a gift.
Yes,
Right? Like,
he always
he's a
wants to earn
guy.
it.
Yeah, he always wants to earn it, even whenever he's wrestling with God.
Yes.
There's a point where God's like, you need to stop. And Jacob says, I will not stop until you bless me. Right? And you just realize that that is the epitome of Jacob's life. It's kind of like, and Jacob really is a picture of all the people of Israel going forward, and also Christians, right?
Yes.
We love working for something. We don't like receiving something freely, right? Like, even whenever we understand that salvation is by grace through faith apart from works, we always want to do something as if we're earning something from God.
Yeah.
Like, it's how we're hardwired. And Jacob's exactly like that. Like, Jacob really is a picture of all of us. And that's probably why we look at him and we're like, oh, he's the worst. Because he kind of pictures all of us. And he doesn't know how to accept a gift. He's always striving for something. He always, he knows how deceptive he is. And he knows he always expects something of somebody else. And so he always thinks they expect something of him. And so he always wants to earn it. But like you mentioned, this is a high moment for him because we see that he is kind of asking for a favor.
Yeah.
And he's not saying, like, he has nothing to offer them because he realizes he's going to die.
Right.
Right? He's like, I've got nothing to give you. My days are coming to an end. But if I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and show me Hesed and Emet. Right? Show me what I have no right to expect, but be faithful to me. Show me what a true son would do.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have the Hesed-Emet combination where it's like, okay, do your responsibility, but the responsibility that I have no right to expect from you. Right? Like, go above and beyond.
Yeah.
And the request is quite simple. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. That is why most often whenever you read the Bible, it'll say they were gathered to their ancestors because the way that people were buried for a long time period is that you would take their bones, like once it decomposed, you would put it in a little ossuary thing, and you would put it in the collective, like, familial tomb. Yeah. And so literally they were gathered to their ancestors in the sense of,
next to them.
hey, here's their
jar.
bones, setting next to them in another jar. Yeah. And so he's like, don't bury me here. I want to be buried in the promised land, right? And that's why he'd want to be buried there, because it's tied to the covenant of God. Yeah. And so we really do see this as a high moment for Jacob, where he's... Growth. Yeah, he's grown a lot. Jacob's one of those cool guys where he actually grows as he gets older. We see that with Abraham as well. Abraham grows in maturity as he gets older. Unfortunately, some people we don't see like that. That's how it should be, right? It should be you start in a state of immaturity and you grow towards maturity. But some people we see that that's really not the case. David seems like he was at his high point when he was in the shepherd's fields. And then maybe when he was on the run from Saul. But then whenever he gets in the palace, he's just kind of a wreck. And then towards the end of his life, he kind of goes back and starts really chasing after God again. Yeah. But we do see with Jacob here, it's like really at the end of his life, he starts kind of coming back. Once he has to lose everything, right? All the things he cares about most deeply, right? Whenever he loses Rachel, he loses Joseph. And everything's just being ripped away from him. He finally seems to kind of come and rely on God. And so here we have the final moments of Hesed and Emet, right? He's like, hey, show me these two things, please, if I have found favor in your sight. And so we see, once again, these words all being tied together, favor, Emet, Hesed, they all go together. Yeah. And Jacob says, swear to me that you'll do so. Once again, I think that's kind of classic Jacob sneaking back in there. Yeah. Right? Because it's not enough for him. Like, because Joseph already said, I'll do as you say. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But
he's like, just to make sure.
This is still the same character, right? Yeah. And so Jacob's like, it's not enough for you to just give me your word. Swear to me that you'll do so. So Joseph gave him his word. Presumably he... put the hand under the thigh and did that.
It's almost like Joseph showed him, like, Hesed and Emet. He's like, okay, you showed it to me, now I'm, like, back to my old self. Like, I can be stubborn again. You already showed it to me.
Yeah, it's like Jacob sounding all spiritual. He's like, just do me this one favor. And it's like, wow, Dad, you've grown so much. Of course I'll do it. Prove it. Like, so it's like, you just get that final moment where it's like classic there Jacob sneaks back in there. But then it says, Israel bowed his head, bowed down at the head of his bed. I think it's kind of interesting here. I don't know if there's a reason for this, but we see that the name is going back and forth from Israel to Jacob. Yeah. And really, Jacob seems like it's almost like that was his past self, right? And then Israel is his, like, it's his new person,
Yeah.
right? It's the post, like the changed person,
Right,
Right.
right.
And so Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, right? Okay, so that's just who he is. The time of his life came to an end because that's who he was. The time for Israel to die approached, right? Same person, but now the name is changed because it's his new self, and he's asking for grace, and he's asking for compassion.
Yeah.
But then you get to the end, Jacob said, swear to me you'll do so.
Yeah.
So you have Israel asking a request that's based off of graciousness and compassion and Hesed, and then you have Jacob asking for there to be some sort of oath to make sure that Joseph can't go back on it.
Yeah.
And so there is our final occurrence of Hesed in Genesis.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? I mean, I guess we can just kind of wrap this up
Yeah.
now. Do you have any final thoughts about how this word shows up here?
Nothing about this in particular. I'm kind of sad to be done with Genesis. I really like Genesis.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad we're moving on, but...
Yeah. But I think our occurrences of it in Exodus are going to be even more profound.
Oh, yeah.
Because whenever you get to Exodus, you start, like, Hesed in Genesis is primarily interpersonal.
Yes.
Right? And then you get little moments where it's about, like, God showing Hesed to Abraham, like in Genesis 24 and stuff. But it's really mainly interpersonal. When you get to Exodus 34, or when you get to Exodus, specifically Exodus 34, that's where God really starts hammering in the fact that, like, this is one of my key attributes.
We haven't had God explicitly say the word Hesed yet, right?
No, God hasn't said it yet.
Yeah, so that'll be the first time that he says it.
Yeah, so God's going to start talking about it more explicitly in Exodus, but we have had Hesed describing God in Genesis 24 and everything. But yeah, so right here in Genesis, we just kind of have the groundworks of Hesed being laid, and then once we get into Exodus, we're actually going to see what God has to say about it, right? Like, how does he view the term Hesed? How does he view it in regards to himself? How does he view it in regards to everybody else?
Yeah.
That's where we're really going to start it getting developed there. And so Genesis, kind of like it is with everything, it's more of an introduction.
Yeah,
right?
I think it gave a good foundation, though, especially because the first... was it 2 or 3 occurrences? We see kind of like the negative aspect of it, and then we see it applied with different characters.
Yep.
So I think it laid a really good foundation of different occurrences, words that are around it. We got to see it with Emmett.
Yeah.
So
It kind of worked out to where the way we broke this up, it seems like all the different occurrences kind of just fit into these different categories.
Yeah, they did.
Right? To where like, I mean, we just kind of just been going through and just being like, okay, it's been about an hour. I guess we can wrap up.
Yeah.
But like the first 3 occurrences, those all seem to be abuses of Hesed.
Yeah.
And then whenever you got to chapter 24 and 32, those were actually good examples of Hesed, right? In chapter 24, you have God showing Hesed to Abraham through the servant, and you also have Rebecca showing Hesed and all this different stuff. And then you get to 32, and that's also a good example where Jacob is saying, like, God, you have shown me Hesed. And so those are really good examples. Then you get to 39, 40, and 47, which we covered today. And those all seem to be about kind of like elevating statuses. You get to see how Hesed is really unexpected.
Yeah.
And so... Yeah, it seems like it all kind of just worked out there.
Yeah. Also, one more thing. It's also cool. I think it's interesting, which will be cool to see how it plays out in the other books too, but how Hesed doesn't necessarily have to be explicitly said for you to see the traits of it interwoven throughout the different verses. Which is just kind of cool because we think that it's, we believe that it's the inspired word of God. So it would make sense that it's within the traits and the characteristics of the different characters and throughout all the verses without having to explicitly be said.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool too.
Oh, I mean, you could easily just do a study through the Bible. Like, this would be fun to do.
Yeah.
Like, if you were just wanting to read through the Bible in, like, a different way than just reading through the story, you could just read through the Bible looking for Hesed. Right? Not just for the word, but
right.
like, because right here we've mentioned the 11 times it's explicitly mentioned.
Yes.
But Hesed shows up in Genesis so much more than that. We've kind of mentioned it as we go, but once you know what Hesed is, that's kind of the goal of this video. This video is not to be exhaustive about Hesed. That would be literally impossible. We're just trying to talk about the examples of it so that by the end of this series, or even hopefully by now, you're at the very beginning of the series, you're beginning to get an idea of what it is so that you can look for it throughout the rest of the Bible. And so really, Hesed is something that it's throughout all of it. That's why we're spending so much time on this.
Yeah.
I didn't just pick a random word. I think it's one of the most important words and concepts and doctrines throughout the entire Bible.
Yes.
And it really is a lot like graciousness, and that's why it shows up so much in the New Testament. And so I think you really could just read the Bible looking for Hesed, and if you did that, it would probably teach you a lot, because you would see how prevalent it shows up. I mean, it is literally everywhere. Yeah. And so, yeah, there we go.
Cool.
All right, thank you so much for watching this video, part 4. Next time we will be getting started with Exodus.
Yes.
That'll be
On to
fun.
the next one.
Once again, happy Father's Day, and to everybody watching this, thank you so much for watching this. Once again, if you want access to these slides, you can get those at nowletsbehonest.com/resources, and you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/David Tate, or you can access both of those by clicking in the link in the description down below. Other than that, once again, please like the video. If you haven't done it so far, what are you doing? Subscribe to the channel. If you haven't done that so far, really, what are you doing? And then also turn on the notification bell so that you know when other videos like this are coming out. And also comment below because we want to hear from you. We want to talk to you. We like interacting with you. The channel is fairly small right now, and so I can still respond to people, and I like responding to you. And so let us know what you think about this. If you have any other thoughts, just let us know. I like talking with y'all. Other than that, be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. My name is David.
And my name's Brian.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest. We will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.